Okay, it looks like we're live.
Hello, Mexico.
Hello, hello. We're just going to have a little bit of a casual conversation before we start, just to make sure everybody's settled from lunch. Make sure that Coco in the interpretation box can hear us. Is she good, Coco? Alan's wandering around with his laptop and checking in on things. I'm assuming that all is well in the English room. Yeah, English room isn't too far away, so somebody could always be a runner and come back and tell me if it's a problem. So
Coco's all set up.
Coco's all set up. So maybe I'm just going to give a quick, get a thumbs up from everybody in the room. Is everybody hearing good? Is it good? No? Everybody's good over there? Okay. I need to see from the faces in the room that everything's excellent. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you. So we are going to begin. I think it's is it 3 o'clock here?
We're walking around.
Okay.
We're walking around to the English room.
Okay, walking to the English room. We are at the top of the hour. It is after lunch, and we're going to get going here. I hope that everybody who's in this room is here because they want the Spanish earpiece, because they won't be able to hear me unless they go to the English room. Sound good?
The sound is good in the English room.
Okay, excellent. Alan's in the English room.
It sounds good in my room.
Excellent.
The longest intro.
Yeah, here it is. So we're going to begin. I am really, really pleased to have Paul Stacey join us. He is actually joining us from Delft in the Netherlands right now, where it is. What time is it there, Paul?
I'm not sure. It's like 10 or 11 o'clock at night, I guess.
Okay, so we're keeping Paul up, and he's so graciously agreed to be part of our expert guest invite on this topic. And it turns out, Paul, that the questions that we have for you actually really work really well with the topics that we've been addressing today. And tomorrow is our final project day, so the insights that you will provide, I think, will help guide where the participants and where the professors are right now and they're thinking about a project. My only concern right now is that at some point my microphone kicks out and loses battery power, in which case I'll be a little bit concerned about that. But let's hope that this works right now. So Paul Stacey is, actually I didn't get a bio from you, but I'm just going to do a very bad job of just saying what your new title is and what your involvement in Open has been over so many years. I'm going to guess probably at least 20 years.
Yeah, a long time.
So Paul is there's a lot of experts in Open, but Paul is really one of the real experts. So it's really fantastic that he can join us today. He is the executive director now, a new position, correct? Pretty fresh.
Yes.
Of the Open Education Consortium. Did I get that right?
That's correct. Yeah, good work.
And the significance of that, which I don't know if all the professors here are aware of, is that last year the Agora project that these professors all participated in actually won an award from the Open Education Consortium for open faculty development. And everybody in this room was part of that. So congratulations, but you are now speaking with Paul Stacey, who is now the executive director of that organization. And prior to that, Paul worked at the Oh, I'm getting some hands. They're okay. There's a problem with the sound? You can't hear the sound. Oh, so the microphone's cutting out? Okay. I thought this might happen.
My microphone or your microphone?
No, it's my microphone. We've been having troubles with our microphone.
We're fine. We're fine.
Oh, it's good? Okay, it's good now? Okay, excellent. Okay, so we're good. Paul also worked for the Creative Commons, and the professors this week learned about Creative Commons licenses as well. So, Paul, why don't I just let you jump in there and add a few biographical details that are relevant, maybe?
Okay. Well, yeah, thanks, Dennis. And so it's really an honor to be invited to participate in this. Let me say that up front. I'm super pleased to be here, and am huge fans of the team that is hosting the UDG Agora for you. And I consider them my friends and professional colleagues. As Tanis says, I've been involved in open education really for a very long time, going back to 2003 when I helped found BC Campus and led for 9 years an open education resource initiative that funded the development of online curricula that had to be shared. And then after that, I went to Creative Commons, whereas Tanis says I actually supported the development and implementation of open education around the world. And I suppose in that context, more than education, I also supported all the other areas of openness, like open access and open GLAM and open data and open science and all those others. And now I'm the executive director of the Open Education Consortia, which is also an incredible honor, and it's a delight to have what I'll say is a senior leadership position where I can not only sort of advocate for open education, but actually lead where I think it should go and influence others around that. So I consider that a real privilege, and have been taking it to heart right away, actually, and starting to try to suggest what I think should happen in this space.
And one of the things that we were doing today, we're trying to introduce the professors here in Mural UDG to international organizations or ways of connecting and finding out about projects internationally, and connecting with those and those people and those projects. And I'm wondering if you could maybe just tell us a little bit about what these professors should know about the OE Consortium, and why they should know about it. What does the organization do, and why is it important?
Sure. Well, so maybe first of all, I'll say that we're actually a long-standing organization. It's been around for a long time, emerging out of the Open Courseware initiative that MIT launched, way back in 2002. And so initially, the Open Education Consortium was the Open Courseware Consortium, and about I think 7 or 8 years ago, they changed their name to encompass all of open education, not just open courseware. We're a membership-driven organization, so we have members really from all over the world, and our membership is not just from, say, the global north, but also the global south in a big way. And that's something I'm really excited about. I think that there's some amazing developments happening in the global south, and I think that the whole equity and inclusion and diversity aspects of that are an important direction for open education. So we have between 200 and 300 members from around the world. We have been acting as a thought leader and an advocate and a champion for open policy in this space for quite a long time. We run Open Education Week, which is actually happening this week. That's an event that is hosted by the Open Education Consortia. And we also run one of the few global conferences that deals specifically with open education, which is called Open Education Global, or OE Global. And this year it's actually happening here in Delft, which is one of the reasons I'm here right now. And then we also give out awards, Tanis, as you've mentioned. But I'll say that under my leadership, I expect us to shift a little bit, not to stop doing those things, but also to do more things. And in particular, I'll say that actually leading a strategy session on this on Monday and Tuesday, but I'm hoping to move towards a model that involves a kind of almost an emulation of B2B and B2C, the kind of traditional e-commerce kinds of activities that have led to success in doing online business. But the model I'd like to pursue is what I'm calling member-to-member services. So how do we take the activities and expertise and resources that our members have and make them kind of curated and contextualized to be useful for other members? And so rather than my organization inventing something from scratch, I'm looking to actually reuse and remix resources from existing members and make them available to other members. And then in the member to community context, I'm also thinking about how is it that the resources and initiatives our members have in place might benefit the open community, whether you're a member or not. and how might we be deliberate about that in terms of developing a strategy for making that successful and useful to the open community writ large.
You touched on so many things, actually. So I'm just going to, because there's some of the things that you said that I really believe came up today in our own conversations as well. And certainly the one of reuse and what we're doing in the open space and actually building, trying to look more to build as opposed to start from scratch with our wonderful ideas. So this week we've been exploring a variety of topics around open, including open pedagogy, this responsibility of open technology, both the good and the bad. Open scholarship was today. We talked about open data, open research, and open publishing. And throughout the week, we've been trying to adopt a critical approach to these topics and to identify gaps. And the gap thing has come up quite a bit. So you've worked internationally with both Creative Commons and now the OE Consortium. So would you mind sharing where you think attention should be in terms of gaps or things that open should focus on?
Well, as you've sort of described, I think open has become a much more multifaceted and in some ways more complex space than it was in the early days. Mm-hmm. I would describe open in a way that it would include the kinds of means of being open that you've described. But I also, from my Creative Commons work, would say that my landscape of open is pretty broad. And so when I think about what all of the aspects of open are that are at play in the education sector, I include open source software, open source hardware, I include open GLAM, the galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, because every, let's say, higher education institution has a library on campus. And so how does openness play out in the library context? I think open science has become a pretty big thing, especially in Europe, and that has its own unique sort of complexities and angles when it comes to openness. And then, of course, we have some of the things you've mentioned: open access, open data. But maybe even I would add to these things that we typically talk about by saying I think open policy has an important role to play. And often when there's open policy being discussed, we're talking about open government, which I think can also play a significant role. And then, of course, we come down to the open education and the resources and pedagogy and scholarship components of that. But what I'm trying to say is that I think when I think about gaps, one of the gaps I see is that we have all these means of being open, but they're largely siloed from one another. And they largely operate autonomously from one another. So if I was to simply take, let's say, open access research publishing and open education resources, rarely do those two groups talk to one another. And this is one of the critical gaps that I see has happened, is that openness has become siloed. And yet, I would argue that there's a shared set of principles across all of these means of openness. And because they share a common set of principles, there's the potential for them to function in a way that is mutually complementary and synergistic. And so I'm actually, as a significant area of gap, looking to see how might we actually think about combining these means of openness strategically within our institution to enable a greater impact around how openness is used. And all of the benefits that we associate with openness can be spread and realized across these multiple means of being open. And so that's one gap, is how do we move away from a siloed approach to openness to a more integrated and synergistic approach to openness that is actually tackled strategically, where we don't just kind of wait for the different groups to talk to one another, but we actually strategically try to bring them together. So that's one area of gap. I've got a bunch of others. I would say, I think if I reflect back on the early days of open education, it was all about learning objects and small resources that are components of a course. And then, we've sort of built out larger and larger components. And there's a huge focus currently around open textbooks, but there's also a growing focus around complete degrees. And so when we think about Z degrees or Z degrees, I actually think that there's a need there, there's a gap there that is around how do we look at not just zero cost associated with those degrees, but the full implementation of all of the potential that openness brings in terms of open pedagogy, in terms of the way that we utilize data and the analytics associated with the learning that's taking place. There's a bunch of gaps there that I think could be implemented within the context of building out complete degrees. And I'm also looking there to see a greater diversity around the academic context in which these degrees are being created. So I think there's a huge potential. I'm really pleased to see that we're moving towards bigger scale initiatives, but I worry that we actually have not leveraged all of the unique affordances of openness within those complete degrees. And I think that's an absence and a gap that ought to be addressed and fulfilled. I'll just stop there.
No, that's fantastic. We might circle back to gaps again, perhaps through some of the other questions. So that's really great. One of the things that comes up around open again and again is the issue of quality. And certainly in my own observations, it feels like there's even geographical differences in how far up the list of priorities quality actually is, or concern for quality is. And in your work internationally, I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit about what you've observed about the conversations around quality and open.
Well, I'll say a couple things here, because I think the typical response to the quality question is to turn to the various rubrics and scorecards that others have developed. So whether it's the Online Learning Consortia's quality scorecard, or whether it's Quality Matters and the rubrics that they provide, or even some of the institution-specific quality assessments like those from the University of Southern California, for example, all of which are really good. Don't get me wrong. I think they're very useful when it comes to thinking about quality of curricula. But I was asked this very same question today in several sessions I gave today, and I decided to tackle this question slightly differently, Tanis. And so let me talk about what I now am calling the quality facets of openness. So less to do with the academic rigor and, sort of how good is your assessment, and more to do with when we look at something that is open, how do we assess its quality? So let me sort of throw out a few. These are sort of Paul, this is not well researched.
Oh, it froze first. Hang on, Paul, it just froze.
And you actually find it. So if I do a search for it, will I discover it? You'd be surprised how many open resources are not actually discoverable or findable. So step one is, can you find it? And if you can find it, okay, it's actually a higher quality open resource than one that isn't findable. And then is it really accessible, or is it actually behind some kind of paywall or password? If it's behind a paywall and password, I think its quality goes down from an openness perspective. Is it viewable? That's another one. So if you look at all the content that gets uploaded into repositories, you can see a list of all the assets through the metadata. But then if you actually have to download the resource to view it, that's actually a lower quality experience than one in which you can actually view the resource immediately when you find it. And then I'm saying that there's a contextual component to the openness as well. So let's say you found a resource, you've gone through the process of downloading it out of a repository. What often happens there is that you download the raw resource stripped from its academic context. A lot of institutions now are delivering open education in some sort of education technology or learning management system, but typically that's not part of the viewing and downloading process associated with assessing whether a resource is reusable or of interest for reuse, because it's been stripped from its full academic context. And so I'm actually now looking for the display of these resources in their full academic context. So you see the resource as it's viewed by a student or a faculty member. And if you cannot see it in that way, in my view, the quality has been degraded. And then another component of openness of quality from an openness perspective would be, is it editable? I mean, I'm absolutely floored by the number of resources that are openly licensed but published in a format, whether it's a PDF or other format, that is completely uneditable. And the fact that it's uneditable is, in my view, a degradation of the quality of its openness. And so the more editable it is, in my view, the increased quality that resource has from an openness perspective. And then we could look at the licenses. It sounds like you looked at CC licenses. So I do think that a license that enables reuse and remix is a higher quality open license than one that does not. So if you choose, no derivatives, then I think that's a lower quality open resource than one that allows for reuse and remix. I will also say, though, that maybe contrary to a lot of my colleagues in the open space who advocate for CC BY as being the default license, I advocate for CC BY SA because I think that one of the things we've overlooked is the importance of the building of a community around the resource. And I think that share alike creates some contribution back to that community that I think of as being really important for the health of the community. So so that's another aspect is the license, and the choice of license there, I think, affects the quality of openness of a resource. And I have just a few more. So let me dwell on this just momentarily, Dennis, because I think this is actually quite important stuff. Another one that I have, this is, again, these are Paul's rubric of quality of openness. But one that I have that is increasingly, in my mind, hugely important is, does the resource have a community that surrounds it? In other words, I see a lot of authoring of open content that gets thrown out or is used by a single faculty member, but nobody else. Now, I'm actually thinking that the quality of an open resource is higher when it has a huge user base or a large number of co-authors that are committed to the use and improvement of that resource over time. And the larger that community base that surrounds a resource, the higher its quality, I would argue. And then the last couple are, is it relevant? So does the resource have a fit to the teaching and learning need? Is it something that is an engaging experience from a learner's perspective? So when a learner engages with the open education content or resource, is it an engaging experience? And then finally, I would say that, does it achieve the learning outcome that you're seeking to achieve? What's the impact? What's the outcome? And a high quality open education piece of material will actually fulfill a learning outcome. And you'll notice that I've left out of all of that any kind of discussion around production values. Does it look good? Is it beautifully designed? Is it sort of all slick and all polished? Because one of the things I've experienced, Dennis, is that you don't have to have a high production media value resource to achieve a fantastic learning outcome. And so I think sometimes we are misplaced in our thinking around the need for it to look all singing and all dancing, when really the actual thing that it needs to achieve is the learning outcome that everyone's seeking. And so I'll stop there to say that this is a slightly different, nuanced angle on what quality means. And this angle is more about how do we assess the quality of the openness of the content as opposed to its rigor from an academic perspective.
I think that's actually a really nice complement to some of the things that we did this week around quality, but also in terms of what we're trying to think about in the larger, more international open space. So I'm really glad you shared those World According to Paul thoughts on quality, because as soon as you write them out, I'll be referencing them, I'm sure. They sounded pretty good there. The last question that I have for you before we open it up a bit more to the participants is, as you know, today is International Women's Day. We've had a variety of activities we've been doing with that theme around open data and that sort of thing. And are there areas of open where you think, internationally or based on your own experience, where we could be doing a better job when it comes to considering gender and open? And, this may be open research, data, publishing, pedagogy, tech, whatever it might be. But maybe you have some thoughts on that.
I do, yeah. I mean, you sent me this question in advance, and I'll tell you right now that this question has been the one that's been occupying my mind the most. It's a really interesting question, and I've been thinking about it in a bunch of different ways. And so maybe I'll just talk a little bit about how I've been thinking about it. One of the things I would say is that, in my view, open is equally open to participation by women or men. And so in that way, it's kind of gender neutral. And I really like that about open. I think a lot of other aspects of education are not so equal or gender neutral. And I would argue that open, at its very foundation, is gender neutral. It enables participation equally from anyone. And because you don't have to ask permission to go open, you can just go open on your own, I think that it empowers women equally to men. And so even at that level, I think there's some inherent value to openness around its gender neutrality and around the way it is equally possible for women and men to participate. And I really like that about it. As you allude, I've done a lot of work now in this space globally. And when I reflect, so one of the things I've been doing this past week is I've been reflecting back on, what's been my experience of dealing with people working in this space, and have I been mostly dealing with men, or have I also been dealing with women, and what has been my experience dealing with the women? And I would say that it's been relatively equal. I would say that some of the most powerful advocates for openness have been women. And so when I reflect on who are the people who've been most impactful for me in terms of my own engagement with the open education space, or who I have admired as leaders, including yourself, Tanis, I would say that many of them are women. And I'm not just speaking about women in North America or Europe, I'm speaking globally. And so when I think back on the work I did in Creative Commons Global Network, for example, there were some amazing women that I thought were incredible advocates and very powerfully outspoken about the benefits associated with openness for their community and for their work. So those are some of the good things. Let me reflect on some of my concerns. If I look at this issue more broadly, let's say, how has society been advancing in terms of women's representation in the workforce, in management, etc. I think that it's been a kind of mixed message or a mixed outcome. I was just reading a study actually earlier this week that looks at data associated with women taking on management roles over a 30-year period, and there is some good news there in that the women's representation in management is higher than it's ever been. Of all the new jobs in management that have been created, over half of them are now have been taken by women, which is great. But there still is this, I'll call it an occupational gender segregation. So if we look at women's involvement, and I think this is true for education as well, that involvement tends to still be in fields that emphasize, let me call it people-centered caring skills, while there's an overrepresentation of men in fields that deal with production and engineering and math and so on. And so until we get gender equality in some of these specific domains, as including within education, I think we're going to be facing some issues, because I think that the way that those disciplines get taught tends to favor men over women. And so one of the gaps, or one of the areas where I really think we need to look at things more closely, is in diversifying the representation of women beyond people-centered caring professions to other domains and disciplines. And I think we also need to look at teaching and learning pedagogies that are optimized for women. This might be a controversial topic, but I think that we have not actually paid much attention to the unique ways in which women might learn and how those differ from men. And if we really want to achieve equal engagement across all domains and disciplines within open education, I think that when it comes to such areas like open pedagogy, we need to think about whether the open pedagogies we're actually utilizing are equally beneficial for women as they are to men.
Okay, well, we may get some questions about that, but I do want to give the opportunity for participants to ask questions. I believe the method for doing this is to post it in Contestar. I need actually somebody to relay the questions to me so I can relay them to you if somebody wouldn't mind doing that. I just remembered that.
Oh, good. Oh, it's too
You
bad.
gave us lots of food for thought, and thank you so much for like really addressing these questions so completely. So let's see what we have in terms of questions.
No questions yet, but we're trying to prime the pump.
Okay. We could maybe try and do an oral question and then run it up, I suppose. I could repeat it into the microphone. Could do that if that's faster. But Contestar is our threaded discussion board that's very open that you may be able to see. And then you can always jump in there and see, too, what questions are in there as it's a visitor. Yeah?
Oh, they could ask on my computer. I could bring my computer out.
Okay, there is a question over there. Okay, so Alan's roving around with his computer. I'm doing a fabulous job of giving you the view of the room. Right there.
So yeah, so people should know that I really like questions. And so if there's no questions, I won't be happy.
Okay. Can you hear him?
Okay, la pregunta es, ¿por qué medir con la misma calidad el trabajo licenciado y el trabajo abierto? Creo que se deberían de medir con dos criterios diferentes.
So if I understood the question correctly, the question was, is there different quality criteria for, I guess, closed license content versus open content? I don't know if I understood the question correctly, quite honestly. So if there's somebody else that wants, did I get that question right? Did I understand that correctly? I don't know. Maybe you could repeat it again. Thank you. I don't know if I totally understood the question.
Okay, we'll try again.
Yeah. We've got Mel here running a translation.
Okay, can you repeat the question?
La pregunta es, ¿por qué se tendría que medir como criterio de calidad el que haya más trabajos licenciados o en PDF y que trabajos de recursos abiertos? O ¿por qué tiene que ser un criterio de calidad ese? Y la segunda pregunta...
Well, come on.
Oh.
Okay, so the first question is, okay, just a second. The first question is, why are the same quality criteria applied to open and closed resources? Or are they?
Well, I would say that what they are in general. You know, the quality matters, and the online learning consortia's scorecards and rubrics are applied to closed and open content in the same way. And I think part of why I wanted to address the quality of open uniquely is because I think that we have to look at what is unique about open that's different from closed. And if we can identify what the unique opportunities are, the unique aspects of openness are in terms of quality, then I think that we can begin to do things with openness that are simply not possible to do with closed. And so part of my argument or thinking at this point, it's not so much an argument, is that, hey, you know, if we're going to talk about open education and quality, why don't we begin to define the quality of open education in unique ways that differ from the quality of closed education? Because if we start to identify what's unique in the terms of quality for open education, then we can actually enhance the education associated with openness in ways that are different than what we can do with closed. And I personally think That's really important. It's an important concept that there are things that you can do with open education that you cannot do with closed. And I think it's important to start thinking about what those are from a quality point of view. But I'll say that, hey, look, this is like a whole research field for somebody to pursue.
There's a challenge for tomorrow's activity right there. And then was there a second question then, or is that good? Yeah. We've got a question. So the question in Contestar is, what challenges come with open education? That's a big question. Maybe tackle one little slice of it. What challenges come with open education?
Oh boy. Well, I'll say the challenge I hear most frequently is that it takes a lot of time, and I don't have that time. And I mean, I hear that repeatedly. I heard today lots of questions around what's in it for me when it comes to faculty, what's the incentive? And so let me kind of quickly address those, just quickly, Tanis, because I think that there are some obvious answers now to those questions. And the fact that they keep coming up over and over again is actually holding us back. So I think there isn't enough time question needs to be addressed by taking a team-based approach to the creation of open education. We need to move away from the notion that this is a lone ranger kind of thing that a faculty member does all on their own. That may have been the old model of creating teaching and learning materials, but that model is not an effective model when it comes to open education. So I'm a big advocate of a team-based production process where you team up faculty with librarians and instructional designers and media producers and ed tech people, and collectively they can accomplish something that is incredible that wouldn't have been possible if you're simply relying on the time of a single faculty member all by themselves. And then when it comes to, what's in it for me, why should I do this? What would be the benefit to me as a faculty member for doing this? I mean, I think inherent in that question often is, where's the money? What's the financial incentive for me to do that? And sometimes there are financial incentives. Sometimes there's small startup grants to do all kinds of things. But that's usually one-time money. And I would be saying that really we ought to be seeing the production and development of open education as just a regular part of the process that you do to create curriculum materials. And why is open education needing to be treated somehow differently? And I think that there are some built-in value propositions that have nothing to do with money. And I think it's important for us to look at what those are. I think that we're beginning to see that open education provides this value to a faculty member and an institution that are really, really important and have nothing to do with money. They have to do with equity of access. They have to do with better learning outcomes. I'm pleased to see a growing body of research around open education that shows that, if students have all the resources they need for their learning from day one, they're much more successful and less likely to drop out than students who haven't bought the book, let's say, because it's too expensive. And so there's, I think, a lot of really interesting values and incentives that are baked into open education that haven't been part of the equation previously. I would be saying that in some ways, open education has forced the visibility of teaching and learning curricula that previously was not visible. And because now it's visible, there's a kind of peer review process that's baked into open education that can be a bit scary at first because maybe you used resource materials that you aren't necessarily super proud of and you don't want peers to see. But because peers are going to see it, it's a bit like the rigor that gets applied to research. There's going to be peer review, and so you try to do really high quality work. And because that raises the bar, I think that there's some benefits that happen associated with both the benefits to students, but also the benefits associated with teaching that come from some sort of peer review. I'd love it to be not just peer review, but peer collaboration.
I think we have another question.
Okay.
From the gentleman. Yeah. Just know that there's about a 15-second delay before the translator gets the question. So here we go again.
La pregunta es, no es más que pregunta. Más que pregunta es una opinión. Creo que es mejor criterio de calidad, la equidad de acceso, que el número de personas que acceden a un recurso abierto.
Oh, yeah. So just sharing a comment that that more than a quality criteria, just the importance of quality criteria is that the number, the access, I guess, was it the number of access, or that's important. Like, what is the outcome, basically, that's perhaps more important than quality. If people can access it, that overrides perhaps any discussion of quality. I think that's how. I think I have to say I at times share that view. So, but that was just sharing a comment. We do have a ton of questions actually in Contestar.
All right, excellent.
Yeah, and just to let you know, there's about a 15-second delay in the translation. So.
And just tell your camera roving person that I enjoy seeing the people in the crowd.
Oh, yes. Okay. Okay. So the next question that came in on Contestar is, how do you imagine, like, what is a world, an ideal world of open education look like to you?
Okay, it's just a small question. Okay, so it sort of looks like this. I actually have such an idea. You may not be surprised to know. It looks something like this. Open education starts in primary school and is in place as a form of digital literacy with young children, such that through primary and secondary school, it's standard practice to both access and use and create open education as part of the learning process, such that by the time you get to higher education, you're already well versed with this. It's not a new concept, it's an expectation. I also think that when I think about this in the kind of idealized view that Paul Stacey has, it's something that is holistic, I'll say. So the concept of open doesn't just apply narrowly to teaching and learning resources. It applies broadly to the entire institution and education experience. So I'm looking, for example, for institutions. Okay, so now we're doing Z degrees and Z degrees. You know, we're building an entire degree. But when is an institution going to have all of its curricula across all degrees open and be the new kind of open university? You know, there's this concept of an open university from the past, which meant a certain kind of thing. I think in the new context of open education, I'm looking for institutions to go, we're going to make all of our curricula across every academic domain, across all degrees, open. And by doing so, we have the potential to fully realize the benefits of open on a scale and impact that we cannot realize if we're just doing it at a course level or a little micro level where the incremental impact is small. And so I'm looking for an institution to go for the whole full meal deal. Like, why fool around? Let's just go open all the way. And while we're going open with our teaching and learning, why don't we go open with data? Why don't we go open with research? Why don't we go open with education technology? Why don't we go open with, basically, go for the whole thing? And yes, okay, that's complex and difficult and, not like anything we do currently. But when I look at what's happening in the global south, I'll just say this again, I think that there's an incredible opportunity to essentially leapfrog, because a lot of what's happening in Europe and North America is kind of stuck on the old original ideas around what open education meant. And now we know so much more, but they're not quite engaged so deeply with it. And so I think there's this incredible opportunity to kind of leapfrog forward in this way, that the innovation and leadership is going to come from another part of the world.
We have a couple of questions that we might combine here. There's actually a lot of questions, so but I know that you have to get to sleep at some point.
No, please. I'm not fired up now. I won't be able to sleep.
So I'm gonna try and combine two questions here. But how do you create awareness of open education resources in small communities or very isolated communities to actually then potentially help and give agency to these communities as well? And related to that is that open education is intimately linked to the use of technology, but there's communities and individuals who don't have access to technology, and this actually depends on political will in order to advance the situation. So I see those two questions as sort of related, like how, open education is wonderful, it's supposed to help, a variety of different kinds of populations, but yeah, how do you do that?
Oh,
yeah, come on. It's just a small question.
Well, I will say that I think the way we begin to see open education awareness happen is through early adopters, right? So you have someone who has already done something that is, pretty impressive, and you ask them to talk about what they did and to show people what they did and to talk about why they did it and what the benefits associated with doing it have been. So I think it's really fantastic to actually use case studies and real examples of open education as a means of raising awareness and of generating interest in doing more. I acknowledge that a lot of open education is tied to technology, but I don't think it needs to be tied to technology. I think you can do open education without technology, unless we're talking about eliminating paper and pencils and stuff. I mean, sure, it can be enabled to be bigger and more rapidly disseminated and so on through the things that digital provides. But the concept of open education, the concept of sharing resources, of working collaboratively with others around the improvement of those resources and localizing them and translating them, those kinds of practices don't rely 100% on technology. You can do those kinds of things without technology. And so I think that it's, of course, something we all want to see is government support for infrastructure, for internet, for bandwidth, and so on, that are all enablers of doing more and more and more with open education. But I would not at all be saying that you can't do anything for open education without them. Yeah.
Okay. We're gonna combine a couple more questions here too. So there's one really that's about faculty resistance. So whether it's because they don't want to, or they're afraid to, or they have a classical view of education, and there's also a related one about 20th century, 21st century professors, and then also students who may be resistant as well to open education. So I guess the big question is what about resistance?
Yeah, is resistance futile? You know what? I think there's some legitimate reasons why open education is not necessarily the perfect solution for everything. And I'm increasingly sensitive to that. I mean, I've been a long time advocate for open education, but I can see through the work that I've done globally, lots of cases where open education is not the right answer. And in particular, this pertains to fields like indigenous knowledge, where the notion that knowledge is somehow the property of a particular person who has the right to make it open. I think, you know, that does not make sense in that kind of cultural context, and I would not be an advocate for openness in that kind of context unless we rethink how openness is actually implemented from a, I'll say, from a legal point of view. Don't at all think that that resistance needs to be completely overcome. I think that when there's resistance, it's actually worth paying a lot of attention to. And I've actually been a really big advocate of looking at changing the Creative Commons licenses because there's some resistance to some of the licenses for really legitimate reasons, in my view. But I was totally unsuccessful about doing that. Excuse me. And then I think that student resistance is a really interesting one. And again, something we actually need to be sensitive to, because there's all kinds of issues around privacy and visibility and your desire to actually see your work live on for forever, which sometimes it must or will through open pedagogical practices. And I think that that's something we need to be sensitive to, is what are the issues associated with privacy, and what are the issues associated with asking for students to learn in the open. That doesn't necessarily work for everyone, and I think that we need to be sensitive to that and not mandate it as you must do it this way, but allow for there to be a kind of gradual progression towards that.
Paul, it's so great to have you talk with us. I just got a battery alert here, so I'm going to give you the chance. I mean, I think it's meant to be, because I think it's time that we end here, and we're coming to the end of the day. But thank you again so much. I think I share with everybody just the gratitude for you coming in today and actually giving so much thought to these questions. And some of them were really difficult, and challenging. So I'm really glad you were able to answer them so completely and be part of it and join this conversation. So thanks so much. We really appreciate it. And this, of course, will be available on our webpage as a recorded hangout.
All right. Well, thanks so much for inviting me, and it's super nice to meet you all. Wish I could have been there in person.
We wish you could have been too, but all the best in Delft.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye. Where'd he go?